Professor Nanjundiah, Fellows of INSA, members of the public, and students. On behalf of INSA, I welcome you all to this lecture series, which was initiated by INSA nearly 3 years ago under the Science and Society program to popularize science and also educate general public about the developments in science. In the last several years, we have had some very distinguished speakers who have spoken from this podium. Some of them include Professor T. Ramaswamy, Professor Govardhan Mehta, Professor C.N.R. Rao, Professor Ramamurthy, Dr. Indra Nath, Professor M.S. Swaminathan, Dr. Rohini Godbole, Professor Dinesh Singh, Professor K. Radhakrishnan, Professor Raghavendra Gadakar, the President of INSA, Professor M.S. Valayathan, and many more. In the last nearly 2 months, we have had lectures from Professor D. Balabhasubramaniam, who spoke to us on communicating science with public and policymakers. There was also a talk by Dr. B.V. Sirikantan on science and reality as of 2014. And the last lecture we had was on mathematics as the language of nature, a historical view, which was delivered by Professor N. Mukunda from Bangalore. And today, as all of you know, that we have another distinguished speaker, Professor Vidyanand Nanjundiah from IISc Bangalore again. And he's going to share with us his views on a present-day view of evolutionary theory. Before I invite him, I would like to briefly introduce him, because most of his life he has either been at Mumbai or has been in Bangalore, and only for short visits he has been coming to Delhi. So particularly the young members of this audience may not really know about his background. Professor Nanjundiah had his early education in Mumbai with his focus in studies on physics and mathematics, and did his undergraduate in 1967. Later, he moved to Chicago and did his PhD in physics in 1972, and that was the time that his interest shifted towards biology. He did his postdoctoral work briefly on amphibian development. That was in Utrecht in the Netherlands, before he joined a lab working on cellular slime molds at the Max Planck Institute in Tübingen and Biocentrum in Basel, Switzerland. And since then, he has continued to work on these small organisms of considerable interest to the biologists. He returned to India in 1976 and joined the Center for Theoretical Studies at IISc Bangalore, and from where he moved in 1980 to the molecular biology group at TIFR Mumbai. He returned back to IISc Bangalore in 1989 and stayed there until his retirement in 2013. At present, Professor Nanjundiah is a professor at the Center for Human Genetics, Bangalore, and an honorary professor at Jawaharlal Nehru Center for Advanced Scientific Research, Bangalore. His research interests cover the areas of developmental biology, theoretical biology, and evolution, especially the evolution of social behavior. He enjoys teaching and writing popular science articles and has contributed many such articles in the journals published by the Bangalore Academy. He is a fellow of the Indian Academy of Sciences, Bangalore, and also fellow of Indian National Science Academy. And today, as the title says, that he's going to speak to us on a present-day view of evolutionary theory. And I would not like to take any more time and request Dr. Nanjundiah to make his presentation. Dr. Nanjundiah.
Thank you, Professor Khurana. It's a pleasure to be given an opportunity to speak here at INSA. Before I get going with the talk itself, I should warn everyone that this is not going to be a technical talk. And I've already identified at least 2 members in the audience who are probably specialists in the field that I'm going to cover, and the warning is especially directed to them, not to expect anything by way of technicalities. Okay, very quickly, what is it that I want to try and get across? The notion of evolution is very old, and here, of course, I mean the evolution of living creatures. It's been treated in poetry, in fantasy, in the imagination, and so on and so forth. So there are these marvelous mythological stories of one creature turning into another, Vishnu coming down in different avatars and so forth. all of these are products of a poetic imagination, and of course a rich imagination which gives us pleasure when we listen to these stories. However, the idea that evolution had a scientific basis took root among humans somewhere around 200 or 250 years ago, even though glimmerings of this are to be found in the ancient Greeks, especially in the writings of Aristotle. It's usually a safe bet when you say anything about the history of biology to say that Aristotle thought of it first, because it turns out he thought of most things first. So he thought of evolution first too. But there were huge gaps since then, and what we call the modern theory of evolution, in other words, a statement of ideas based on natural laws, subject to experimental test, subject to refutation, verification, and so forth. This probably goes back to the French scientist Lamarck. Now, Lamarck's role in evolutionary theory is rather interesting because he is universally believed to have been wrong on most counts, if not all counts. Nonetheless, he provided the first serious modern theory of evolution, and at least to that we must give him credit. But when people hear the word evolution today, and certainly students of biology, it's the names of Darwin and Wallace that most often come to their minds. That is because the theory of evolution, which is the most popular as of today and has stood us in good stead for the past 100+ years, is the one put forward by Darwin and Wallace, and in fact this theory has a special name to itself. It's called natural selection. So I'll tell you a little bit about natural selection. But what I also want to do is to point out to you that right from the days of Darwin, people have thought about evolution in other ways, in different ways, and today we are at a stage where the notion of evolution is seen to be, of course, natural selection, to a large extent natural selection, but on top of natural selection, much else. And I'd like to try and get across to your feeling for what this much else implies. So the problem faced by anyone talking about evolution, let's say by evolutionary biologists, is essentially to account for life, to account for living forms, as I put it here, to account for the presence of highly improbable forms of matter, which essentially means you and me, as opposed to this podium or this computer or these chairs or whatever you have. So these highly improbable forms of matter that we call living matter, that we call plants, animals, microorganisms and so forth, inhabit the earth, and it's to try and account for their being here that evolutionary ideas have been put forward. Okay, so now do I wait for the thing to come on, or I'm perfectly happy to carry on as it is. The slides are just a prop. I could tell a story while it's waiting. This is a nice story. It actually has to do with the history of biology, and it's a story told by Delbruck, whose names many of you would have heard of. Delbruck was a physicist who moved into biology, and the reason he moved into biology was because of an accident. He went to Copenhagen to work with Niels Bohr, and someone said, Bohr is giving a lecture this evening, so why don't we go and listen to him? And Delbruck went to the lecture, and like most people who have listened to Bohr, he got bored. Bohr was a notoriously poor lecturer, and anyone who has heard him and has come back without shaking their heads is decidedly exceptional. But what happened was, as you are seeing here, the screen there behind Bohr kept going up and down and started playing tricks, which this one may as well if we wait a while. Apparently that held Delbruck riveted. I mean, the whole audience was fascinated looking at what games this screen is playing. So unwittingly he listened to Bohr. This is a famous lecture of Bohr's, by the way, called Light and Life. And that seems to have triggered Delbruck's interest in biology. So maybe in a small way some of you might get interested in, get hooked on evolution thanks to this, whatever is happening. Sure. So I can keep speaking. Yeah, this is fine. So, I have already told you what it is that I am going to try and get across. So, the first part of my talk will consist of listing the diverse explanations for evolution that we talk about today, that we consider today when we say we are discussing evolutionary theory or talking about evolutionary theory. These explanations come under three different heads, and in the slides there I have called them physical explanations, or explanations based on physics and chemistry. Secondly, explanations based on chance, which is a rather funny kind of thing to call an explanation, but nonetheless it is used. And thirdly, natural selection. So, what I am going to do now is to tell you a little bit about what these explanations based on physics and chemistry are, what these explanations based on chance are, and then we come to natural selection. So, the explanations based on physics and chemistry basically say that in the same way that you see a high degree of organization in the physical world, in the same way that you see a high degree of organization in the non-living world, similarly, the high degree of organization that you see in the living world might be based on similar principles, as simple as that. Okay. So, can one think of specific examples here? Many examples. So, let me begin with something very tiny which we can't see with our eyes, of course, the bacterium. There is a common bacterium which infests our gut called Escherichia coli. This bacterium swims, and it swims by using an oar-like apparatus which it keeps turning round and round, either clockwise or anti-clockwise. This apparatus is spiral shaped, and therefore when it rotates, it gives a thrust to the bacterium which is able to move. So, swimming. Now, the interesting point about this extraordinarily complex flagellar motor, as it is called, of the bacterium, is that it is nothing else but a tiny mechanical device exactly like a motor that you could build in the lab, an electrical motor with a rod which you could build in the lab, which you could cause to rotate and cause the body to move. In fact, people have built models of this flagellar motor. So, the bacterial flagellar motor is a highly complex device which today you could look upon as a product of nanoengineering. So, its explanation in that sense, the understanding of its working is the same as the understanding of the working of any ordinary electrical motor, which results in giving power to a device which moves through a viscous medium, which is what the bacterium does. So, that is one example. The flight of birds, this of course has excited the imagination of people since probably people saw birds flying, and it is very clear now that birds use aerodynamic principles in their flight, not very different from the kinds of things that you find in aeroplanes, heavier than air machines. Essentially, they create an upthrust by causing a pressure differential to come across their wings. Mechanical explanation, physical explanation. There's a small amoeba kind of creature that I work with, and if the slides come on, I'd like to show that one in particular. And this creature is an amoeba, as I've said, but many hundreds of thousands or even millions of these amoebae come together and form a body. So, they do this kind of thing. While doing this, they signal to each other, and they signal to each other by sending out waves of a chemical signal, which you can see with your eye as it happens. You can't see the amoeba with your eye, but because there are these hundreds of thousands of them, you can see the signals with your eye. And if you have a plate or a dish on which these amoebae were growing, you can see the signals have extraordinarily beautiful spiral shapes. So, you see these spiral waves, all very well. What is interesting is that some 40 years ago, 50 years ago, a Russian scientist by the name of Belousov, and later his student, a person called Zhabotinsky, discovered spiral waves which to all outward appearances look exactly like these amoebal spiral waves. These amoebas, by the way, are called slime molds, so we call them slime mold waves. So, if you see two pictures side by side, one, the spiral waves discovered by Belousov and Zhabotinsky, which are waves in a chemical medium. So, there is a recipe. Anyone here, any student here who wishes to set up these waves in his or her lab can do so without any problem at all. I'll be happy to provide the recipe if you want. And they are a great delight to watch. But what's interesting is to present one of these dishes containing these spiral waves to a student with a second dish by the side showing these spiral waves formed by the amoeba, and ask the student to guess which is which. Of course, if you see the dish and if you see the liquid going around, you do know. But if you are shown photographs, it's very difficult to tell which is which. So the explanation in both cases of what is a pattern formed in 2 dimensions by living creatures, in the other case a pattern formed, it turns out, in 3 dimensions this time, but you only see the 2-dimensional part, by chemicals, the explanation turns out to be very similar. It's based on what people call feedback, what people call cooperativity, right, what people call non-linearities. So the same underlying sorts of explanations. So second sort of physical explanation. So there's much in the non-living world which offers us. I'm in a meeting. Can I speak later? There's much in the non-living world which offers us lessons for understanding the living world. But keep in mind one feature of such explanations. These explanations apply to the here and now. They apply to what you are seeing right now. They apply to a structure as it is. They have nothing to say about how the structure came into place. So if you think of these waves in a chemical medium that I told you about, these spiral waves in a chemical medium, you can explain the waves as they are, but the reason the waves came there, of course, is because someone took a bunch of chemicals from the lab and mixed them together and stirred them about and put them in a dish at a particular temperature and so on. The historical process of how the waves came to be is entirely obliterated from the chemical explanation. So physical and chemical explanations generally do not involve history, but they involve matter, materials, their properties, the equilibrium state of these kinds of matter, or the steady states of these kinds of matter. So if you, for example, look at the classical example of a temporal pattern in physics, the planets going around the sun, you really don't ask how it is that the earth came to be somewhere for it to go around the sun in a certain way. All you say is that if there's a large body of this kind, a smaller body of this kind, and there's a thing called gravitational attraction, then they go around each other essentially, which looks like the earth going around the sun. So these are explanations which are called ahistorical explanations. There's no element of history. Please keep that in mind. So one feature of the living world, which is what we started out saying we want to understand, one feature of the living world is accounted for by physics and chemistry, but entirely blurs how that part of the living world came to be ahistorical. Right. The second kind of explanation which I said I would touch on is chance. Now this looks a bit odd, but it turns out in fact that there are many changes which have taken place in the evolution of living organisms which have occurred entirely by accident. The technical word, there are many words used here. One of the technical words is drift, but there are other words used as well. So let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. One of the oldest examples we know come from botany. There is a phenomenon called, well, it's a long word, called allopolyploidy. What it basically means is that you can take 2 species, as I said, it's been found most often in plants, so I'll say 2 species of plants, and essentially by definition these being 2 species cannot mate with each other, so they inhabit different worlds if you wish, which is what one means by different species. But in allopolyploidy what happens is that the genetic material of 2 species comes together, which of course creates a mess because then it becomes difficult to transmit genes thereafter. But sometimes by accident, having come together, this entire genetic material, which is made up of a mix of the material from A and material from B, or more accurately half the material from A and half the material from B, this entire genetic material doubles, right? In which case, whereas you had A plus B initially, you have A plus B plus A plus B, 2 copies of A plus B. And now this turns out to function perfectly capably in certain cases as an acceptable genome, as we say. But what is the outcome? The outcome here is a completely new species, in some sense a hybrid between species A and B, but this is a completely new species which has emerged entirely out of a chance event and has emerged abruptly out of a chance event. This is one example of chance playing a role in evolution. The other example of chance playing a role in evolution came home to us relatively speaking, fairly recently. This was about 50 years ago now. This happened when people started to look in detail at proteins to begin with, and then at genes secondly. So very briefly, proteins are what we are made of. In addition, proteins are, as the textbooks say, proteins are the workhorses of living organisms. So proteins not only build bodies, they enable bodies to be built by acting as catalysts, by acting as pumps, by acting as sensory devices, and so on and so forth. In any case, so about 50 years ago, people started looking at these proteins in detail, and it turns out that proteins are very large polymeric molecules, so they are polymeric chemicals. So people started looking at these chemicals in these polymeric sequences in detail, and they discovered that when they compared sequences of similar proteins, in other words, compared similar polymers between individuals of different species, so let's say between humans and apes, or between apes and monkeys, or between monkeys and some other mammal, four-legged mammal, and so on and so forth. When they did this, they found that the proteins resembled each other, and they resembled each other to such an extent that it was possible to build a tree of resemblances, a link-up of resemblances, based simply on the protein sequences. So people did that. And this linkage of resemblances looked very similar to an evolutionary tree, which of course all of you would have heard of or studied in school, which is a tree traditionally built up by using fossil data or fossil evidence saying who, which organisms share a common ancestor and so forth. And the surprising thing was that the two trees seemed similar, so it appeared as if proteins evolved in some way in parallel with organisms. So to begin with, that was a surprise. Later on, of course, it wasn't, because people realized pretty soon that the evolution of organisms was based on these changes in proteins. But the really surprising element, and this is something that we've had to live with ever since this discovery was made, the really surprising evidence was that these changes in proteins were best explained as having occurred due to chance. So to go into some little amount of detail, it turns out that DNA sequences change abruptly. This is known. These are called mutations. And the surprising finding is that even though most mutations that occur in most DNA sequences that code for proteins, so I repeat, most mutations that occur in most DNA sequences that code for proteins are harmful. So these mutations are removed, they are taken away, because the proteins that result aren't any good to the organism. Excuse me.
Still here. And what they're saying is, in case you can move these slides around, it can be webcast. Webcast can go with slides. How do you keep it?
Yeah, okay, well I will request you to move these slides along, so you'll have to imagine that the slides are succeeding each other here.
Because this is also being webcast, so I think that way to the webcast the slides can go, but here it's not visible. I think that's the only thing.
Fine, but I'll come to where I am now, right? I'll just move through these earlier slides. Okay, I'm surprised. I got about 60% of them correctly. Right. So, to repeat what I was saying, proteins evolve. You can build evolutionary trees based on protein evolution. These evolutionary trees look very similar to conventional evolutionary trees, and that of course we live with now. But the surprising element is that these protein evolutionary trees, and as time progressed, people started building these trees from DNA sequences themselves. So both the protein evolutionary trees and the DNA evolutionary trees show that most of the changes that have occurred in evolution at the level of DNA or at the level of proteins, right? You're with me so far? Most of the changes that occur turn out to be harmful and are eliminated, but of those that remain, the vast majority are neither harmful nor beneficial. What does that mean now? So that means that you have a sequence of DNA, let's say, or a sequence of amino acids which make up a protein. This sequence has changed, right, but the organism in whom the change has occurred is blind to this change, because the change doesn't result in any discernible effect on the organism. So this is a sort of funny consequence, and the consequence is, because this is neither advantageous nor disadvantageous, this change can simply hang around, or of course it can be lost entirely by chance, entirely by accident. Now, continuing on this train of hypothetical reasoning, if the change hangs around long enough for it to spread through the population, which it can, it turns out, entirely by accident. By the way, for those of you who remember a little bit of your physics or mathematics, this is very, very similar to what's called Brownian movement or Brownian motion. Very interesting. And in fact, when people discovered this business with genes and proteins and worked out the mathematical explanation, someone got up and said, we know all of this because this is the same explanation as for Brownian movement. Remember, in Brownian movement, you have a particle, let's say, in the classical experiments of Brown himself, a grain of pollen, which is buffeted by the molecules of water in some random direction, right? And the ultimate path taken by this pollen grain is an entirely random path, because there is no question of one direction being preferred to another. So in the same way, turns out that DNA sequences and protein sequences perform this kind of Brownian movement, or perform this kind of random walk, which is called drift. Now, that, surprisingly, is essentially the bulk of the change that has occurred in DNA or proteins. So please keep this in mind. Change significant at the level of these molecules, insignificant at the level of the organisms within which it has occurred. So those changes that have led, those changes in DNA or proteins which have led to changes in living creatures, visible changes, are a very, very tiny fraction of the total number of changes that have occurred. So this is the second kind of situation in which chance plays a major role. Something else which has been realized rather recently, and this has been a product of, again, of DNA sequencing, this has been truly astonishing, is the following. There are many creatures, and some of them are familiar to us, many creatures which seem to be kind of two-in-one organisms. So the most common example of this is the caterpillar and the butterfly. So the caterpillar is a worm-like creature, the butterfly is obviously quite different, they look different, they live in different areas, they do different things. Quite often the caterpillar or the larva essentially lives to eat, whereas the adult in many insects doesn't eat at all, and their shapes are different, their methods of movement are different, anything. I mean, almost any way you could think of it. In fact, if you saw them separately, you would say there's obviously two different kinds of creatures. But we know they are the same creature. We know they have the same genetic material. So we know that from the same genetic material, the kinds of outcomes that can result can vary a lot, in fact can vary dramatically. Now the recent surprising finding is that in some cases, and I must tell you that the number of these cases is still very small, but in some cases it turns out that these two-in-one sorts of creatures, right, turn out to have had some ancestral fusion of two genomes. It's a little bit like this allopolyploidy that I told you about. But this seems to be somewhat more dramatic, because whole genomes of two different creatures seem to have fused, come together, and the outcome has not been a hybrid creature. Rather, the outcome has been a creature which part of its life looks like one, well, parent, if you like to call it. It's a funny sort of parent, or one ancestor, and for another part of its life looks like a different ancestor. And this has been shown most convincingly in one situation, which involves a fusion of an ancestral starfish genome and an ancestral jellyfish genome. So part of its life it looks like a jellyfish, so you say, oh, this is a jellyfish. Part of its life, I presume everyone knows what a starfish looks like a starfish. So two very different creatures, but turns out that they have two different kinds of genetic material. Now again, a chance event that occurred long, long ago, which gave rise to this sort of dramatic outcome of obvious evolutionary significance because the products are here. Again, this is something which is ahistorical. Both the random walk that I told you about, as well as this sort of chance fusion of genomes, are ahistorical processes, in the sense that in a random walk, the next step that the pollen grain takes is completely independent of all the previous steps that have been taken. So to understand why the pollen grain is at a particular place in this dish of water, all you need to know is where it was a very, very tiny bit of time earlier. That's all. You don't need to know anything else about its past. right? In that sense, it's ahistorical. Of course, the second kind of thing that I told you about, where you have these two genomes fusing, is obviously ahistorical in the sense that this is something which happened once and gave rise to an outcome. So there's no question of a continuous historical past which informs the present of these organisms. Keep this in mind. The third explanation now is the explanation which was first given to us by Darwin and Wallace, and this is called natural selection. Now, the central thing to keep in mind about natural selection is that it brings history firmly into the story, entirely historical. In fact, the explanation of natural selection, well, many different ways in which to say this, but one way is to say that the explanation of evolution given by natural selection is a historical explanation. So it says the ultimate explanation, the ultimate reason for the presence of a particular kind of living creature here on earth, let's say you or me, must be a historical explanation. So in this sense, philosophically, natural selection is an entirely different plane from these two other explanations of evolution. Sorry. Okay. So here we have natural selection. Now, what is natural selection based on? What is this explanation that hinges on history? And natural selection is due to Darwin and Wallace, neither of whom you can see, unfortunately, but there they are. Okay. What does natural selection say? Natural selection says, or Darwin and Wallace said, that there are certain properties that living creatures possess, right? And they possess these properties not because they said so, but because you can test for yourself and see that they possess these properties. What are these properties? Three of them. One, not all members of a species are alike. In fact, most of the time, every individual of a species is different from every other individual. Now, you might say different in what respect? Almost any respect you can think of, right? There are these differences. Differences in height, differences in weight, differences in skin color, differences in muscle tone, differences in ability to digest, differences in ability to see things, eye power, you name it, differences in hearing ability, anything you can think of. Individuals differ. So that's the first element of this explanation known as natural selection. And of course, this difference is something that hits you in the eye, so it didn't need Darwin and Wallace much persuasion to get people to see that this is true. The second element of their explanation of natural selection, again, is something that hits the eye and something that people knew all along, which is that children tend to resemble their parents. Very true. This is what, of course, biologically you refer to as heredity. So heredity is a fact. Children resemble parents. And those of you who have studied some biology know that in some cases the resemblance can be extremely faithful. This happens when a cell, for example, gives rise to two of its own kind, a bacterial cell or a yeast cell or some other amoebal cell gives rise to two of its own kind. In the usual kind of inheritance that is familiar to us, where you have a male parent, a mother and a father together producing a child, the resemblances are not that faithful, but nonetheless they are visible. I mean, people know all along that there are certain traits that run in families, as the saying goes. So, second element. So, the first element was what's called variation. Not all individuals are alike. The second element is heredity. Children resemble parents. Both of these were well known, appreciated, understood. The clinching element was the third element. Darwin and Wallace said that because of these variations, maybe I need to halt for a moment. I think that doesn't work. Okay, we carry on. Second, remember, all of this is going to make you remember this talk much better than you would have in its absence. Right. So the clincher was the third element of Darwin and Wallace's proposition, and that was that because of these variations. Which variations? The variations in respect of which individuals differ and which are passed on from parents to offspring. two properties possessed by these variations. They said because of these variations, some individuals tend to leave behind more children than others. How does this follow? A simple-minded way of looking at this is the following. Let's suppose you are looking at rabbits, right? And let's say you have a bunch of rabbits that differ in their running speeds, right? So this is the variation, right? Now, okay, not bad. What happened? Oh, superb. Okay, let me go through a couple of quick slides. Maybe so that's living matter, living creatures, and there's a whole variety of them. I don't need to spell out what is what. So you have bacteria there, you have amoebae there, I think you have a tortoise on the upper left, and you have a frog somewhere, and so on and so forth. So it's these kinds of things that we are trying to explain. Conventional evolutionary theory, of course, built these plan, a picture of relationships that are conventionally called trees of life. One clue to building these trees was that there were resemblances between individuals. So there's a classic thing from a zoology book which shows resemblances between animal forelimbs. The answers given to that initial question, light off please. Could we have the light off? No? Okay, we'll go on. The answers given to these initial questions were of these three kinds that I mentioned to you. Physics and chemistry as an answer was an ahistorical explanation. This is rather interesting. You might call this a mathematical explanation even, not just physics and chemistry. This is due to a rather interesting a character called Darcy Thompson, who lived 150 years ago, and he pointed out that there were mathematical resemblances in shapes between many body forms. These are two entirely different groups of fishes, and these mathematical resemblances really showed that there was some underlying physical principle due to which these resemblances existed. So what you see here is what's called a conformal transformation, which is essentially taking a grid, like the grid on your graph paper, and tilting the grid a little bit, and you, by just this act of tilting, you go from one group of fish to another. It's something remarkable. Of course, this doesn't mean that fish had these grids and they tilted them, but it gives you a clue that there may be something underlying it that is of interest that you need to look at. Right, so this is what I promised you. So the picture on the left shows these Belousov-Zhabotinsky waves. The picture on the right shows you these slime mold waves. And I think if I hadn't told you which was which, you could have chosen either of them, 50-50. They look exactly the same. This is rather interesting. I didn't have a chance to mention this. So the two things you see here are respectively on the left, a fish, a coral reef fish, and pay close attention to its eye and the patterning of lines around its eye. What you see on the right hand side is a mathematical result due to a model, a theory developed by the famous computer scientist Alan Turing. Now Turing was a remarkable man. He published only one paper in biology, and that turned out to be an earth-shaking paper. So these are sometimes called Turing patterns. What they tell you is that simple physics and chemistry can mimic a great deal of the types of patterns you see in living forms. So again, physics and chemistry is an explanation. That's the bacterial motor that I told you about, the flagellar motor. So on the left-hand side, I'm sorry, it looks a bit out of focus. On the left-hand side, you have an electron microscope picture of the flagellar motor. On the right-hand side, obviously a cartoon, and that cartoon is something that a mechanical engineer could have drawn to show how the motor works. So that was the first answer. So the second answer was chance. As I said, again, that's an ahistorical answer because it has to do with accidents whose outcomes persist or hang on. So this is an example of allopolyploidy between two plant species belonging to the broad Nicotiana tobacco group. Again, the point is that the parental species are shown there on the top. I don't know what the right word is. These are not clearly offspring species in the usual sense, but the species which have come about as a result of genetic fusion followed by genome doubling are shown below, and these are entirely new species now which have come about. Right. So this is an evolutionary tree drawn based on amino acid sequences in a specific protein. In this case, this happens to be the protein used by all of us for breathing. In a sense, it's called cytochrome C. And this cytochrome C tree looks very similar to a conventional evolutionary tree, except that this tree can be perfectly well explained purely on the basis of chance changes, on the basis of what's called neutrality or drift, as it's sometimes called. Oops, somehow we went back to the beginning. Right. This is the case of the two genomic fusions that I said, a jellyfish kind of creature and a starfish kind of creature. Now you have a two-in-one creature. And thanks to genomic sequencing, DNA sequencing, it turns out that there are these two independent genomes within the same body. Now we come to natural selection. And as I said, the crux of natural selection is that it's a historical explanation. There you have Mr. Darwin. Very soon after he came back from this famous voyage around the world, and after having formulated this essential idea of natural selection, even though it took him almost 20 years after the date of this painting to come out with the publication. That's Wallace, taken at roughly the same time. And this is the explanation of natural selection. It works because the individuals of a species are not all alike, because they differ in their ability to survive and reproduce, and because they can pass on these variations to their children. So in short, variation, heritability, and differential reproduction. Now, I want to take a minute to try and stress that these are not postulates given by Darwin and Wallace. Rather, these are assertions made about plants and animals, or if you wish, plants, animals, and microbes, and these are testable assertions, so you can go out and see whether these things are true. If any one of these three propositions is not true, then natural selection will not work. If all three of them are true, natural selection will take place. So the example I was giving you just a moment ago was that of a group of rabbits that differed in running speeds. Rabbits that ran fast tended to have baby rabbits that could run fast. Rabbits that ran slow tended to have baby rabbits that ran slow, right? And clearly, rabbits that ran fast had a better chance of surviving to reproduce and therefore of having children than rabbits that ran slow, because the rabbits that ran slow presumably were picked up by the fox before they had a chance to get very far. So it's as simple as that. So the principle of natural selection really rests on extremely simple postulates. Paradoxically, this itself has made it difficult for many people to accept its validity. And I've personally come across this myself, and I've also read it being recounted by others saying something as simple as this can't be true. Well, it happens to be true in a great many cases, as we have found out. Right. Now, a little bit about what genes have to do with all of this. So our understanding of genes, as I said, is that there are these large molecular polymers inside our bodies. They specify how proteins are made. Proteins in turn, by coming together and making other proteins and other products and so forth, build up our cells, so the parts within cells and then the cells themselves. The cells are organized into tissues, and the tissues come together and form organisms, us, living creatures, right? Let me not go through this in detail, but tell you briefly that genes are made of DNA sequences. These DNA sequences specify proteins. It's the protein that give us these properties that are of interest to natural selection. So it's the proteins in a rabbit that decide whether the rabbit runs fast or slow, right, relative to the other rabbit. Therefore, this ability to reproduce differentially, this ability to have more children than average or less children than average, depends on the protein composition of an individual, and therefore indirectly on the genetic composition or the DNA composition of an individual. So in a sense, what natural selection says, and obviously this was not said by Darwin and Wallace because they had no idea of DNA or proteins. They might have had some idea of proteins, but not of DNA. But what we would say today, and this is sometimes for this reason called the neo-Darwinian theory of natural selection, namely the theory put forward by Darwin and Wallace with everything else added on top that we have learned in biology over the past 100 years. molecular biology being a major component of this learning. So this neo-Darwinian theory of natural selection says that in the course of evolution, creatures change, life forms change, and that change is mirrored in changes in the DNA that they carry. And the reasons for the change are exactly the same as the reasons that Darwin and Wallace gave. Perfectly testable theory, has held up in a great many cases. The theory, as far as it's been tested in the lab, has been very successful. How far it has been successful in nature depends on to what extent people have looked at plants and animals and carried out this test. So a kind of way of looking at this theory of natural selection is as follows. There are environmental pressures. So we go back to the rabbits and the foxes. So as far as the rabbits are concerned, the foxes are part of their environment. So that's the environmental pressure. And the pressure is on to run fast. Otherwise you're gobbled up by the fox. That's an external pressure. Please keep that in mind. Now, does that external pressure result in a change in the organism on which the pressure is applied? Maybe. Maybe a scared rabbit runs a bit faster than a rabbit which is not scared. But that change is not of evolutionary interest. And the change is not of evolutionary interest because it cannot be passed down from this rabbit which is scared and runs fast to its children. However, if a change occurs in the genes of the rabbit, and that has to occur entirely internally, has to occur entirely autonomously, and if as a result of that change the rabbit is able to run faster than average, then it escapes, then it relieves itself. There is a systemic response. You have a faster running rabbit, therefore the environmental pressure gets relieved. So this picture of natural selection is that of an external pressure resulting in an internal change, but not in a cause and effect fashion. The environment doesn't cause the change. Rather, the environment selects those changes which are beneficial to the organism, which is why this thing is called natural, the theory is called natural selection, of course. The change is entirely internal, entirely autonomous, and as I've already told you, most changes in fact are harmful, and of those that are not harmful, most are neutral, and only a tiny minority of those that remain are advantageous. There's a nice cartoon which a friend of mine, Bahram Hushmanzadeh, passed on to me, which encapsulates the idea of natural selection and especially gets home the notion that what we call advantage or disadvantage, the technical term for this is fitness. All of you would have heard of the phrase survival of the fittest. It's important to keep in mind that this thing called fitness is not a property per se. For example, I can say that someone's height here is 171 centimeters, but I cannot say someone's fitness is so and so. Reason being, fitness is entirely a relative quantity. If you have 2 children, you are fitter than someone who has 1 child. But if you have 2 children, you are less fit than someone who has 3 children. Please keep this in mind. Fitness is a relative quantity, and the cartoon shows this because there are these 2 friends running, and the person in yellow decides that perhaps they are running to their doom because they decide, he says, look, we can't run faster than this tiger, I think it's no good. But then his friend in red tells him, I'm not interested in running faster than the tiger, I'm interested in running faster than you. So fitness is computed based on what someone else is doing who belongs to the same species, what someone else's properties are, right? Now, the signature of natural selection, the reason why we think that natural selection is true in a great many cases, is sort of encapsulated in this word adaptation. It essentially means that the products of natural selection, notice that as a result of this, creatures get in some sense better and better at what they are doing. Rabbits get better and better at running away from foxes. Of course, the fox gets better and better in its ability to chase rabbits and so on and so forth. But this getting better and better is precisely the sort of thing that an engineer would do in designing a tool or an instrument or a device. The engineer tries to adapt the device to its requirements. In a similar way, natural selection manages to adapt in this fashion without any design, without any purpose, because remember, at its heart there are these spontaneous random changes. But natural selection manages to adapt living creatures to whatever it is they are doing. So this picture here shows the various adaptations in the beaks of birds. So there are, and by looking at them you can immediately say which bird it is that makes a living by poking its beak deep inside a flower and sucking up the nectar, which bird it is that probably is able to crack nuts, which bird it is that is probably able to pick up very tiny seeds, which bird is it that can probably catch a whole fish, which bird is it that can probably catch a number of fish at one time and store them and then take them home and feed them to the children and so on and so forth. So you see, the shapes of these beaks are really adapted to whatever that bird is doing. And the reason they are adapted can be very, very successfully explained by natural selection. Notice that the other two explanations for evolution that I gave you, namely physics and chemistry or physical principles and chance, are going to find it difficult to come up with adaptation. How do you entirely accidentally come up with something which is the right answer to a problem at hand? So today, in our way of thinking about evolution, the general feeling is the following. The feeling is that where there is a problem faced by a living creature to which it's likely that more than one solution will do, in fact it's likely that a number of solutions will do, and one of those solutions has actually been picked up by the creature, then it may be that chance or purely physics and chemistry is an acceptable explanation, right? However, if the solution to whatever problem, so to speak, faced by the ancestors of this living creature, if the solution happened to be unique, if you had to get to this solution and none other, solution was an adaptive solution, then the chances are that you have to come back to natural selection as the explanation for what you see. So these different kinds of explanations are on different footings. On the one hand, you have adaptation. If you can convince yourself that what you are seeing is an adaptation, then you say, aha, natural selection is probably the answer. And if what you are seeing is not likely to be an adaptation, you may have different answers. In other words, if it's likely to be one of any number of possible adaptations, you may have different answers. Okay. So now I come close to the end of my talk, which is to say, now that we have these three seemingly on a par with each other explanations, why this primacy of natural selection in ordinary evolutionary thinking? Well, the short answer to that is because adaptation seems to be a feature of the living world. Having said that, recent findings, and I've already mentioned a couple of those to you earlier, recent findings have made us sit up and realize that there are certain features of the living world where natural selection alone is not sufficient, which means to say that you need to add something on to the principle of natural selection in these cases, and the things that you need to add on have to do with the features of natural selection that I mentioned a while ago, namely that there was an external stimulus, if you wish, or an external pressure. There was a spontaneous internal response unrelated to the pressure, so the environment did not direct the change. Spontaneous change occurred at random within the individual, and if a change happened to be advantageous, it was picked up by the organism. It's these features that are probably not universally true, and in those cases that they are not true, it's important that we look at alternatives. So here I look at some other phenomena which we need to bear in mind as underpinnings of the evolutionary process. Okay. One of them, and this has been known again since 70 or 80 years, there are many cases of inheritance which work, so variations which are passed on from parents to offspring without any genetic change occurring. This has become a particularly popular area of study today. It goes under the name of epigenetic inheritance, and the picture shown here is one of the oldest examples of epigenetic inheritance. This is a freshwater protozoan, a single-celled organism, something called a ciliate, and what you see there, those dot-like columns that you see there, are actually columns of cilia. These are the swimming apparatuses that these organisms use. Now, in a famous experiment done by a man called Sonneborn about 70 years ago now, what he did was to mechanically cut up one of these columns, turn it upside down, right? You notice you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or 10 such vertical columns. He turned one of them upside down, so obviously this made it problematic for the ciliate to swim at all, but it managed after a fashion. It had a grossly aberrant body plan now, so you can think of this as a boat with a number of oarsmen rowing, and 9 lines of oarsmen are rowing in the same direction. The 10th is rowing in the opposite direction. So this is what it amounts to. What Sonneborn found was that this bizarre change in body morphology, which had been caused simply by this transplantation, was passed down from this ciliate to the two that came from it when it divided into two, to the four granddaughters, eight great granddaughters, and so on. And in fact, it's been passed on for hundreds of generations this way. So clearly there are variations which cause gross changes in form or appearance or properties which can be passed down and which have nothing to do with the genetic material, nothing to do with the form of inheritance that we need for natural selection. Today this has become an extremely important area of study because it turns out that many of such changes can be detected not in this dramatic a form, but can be detected as changes in the DNA itself, but not in the so-called letters of DNA, but in modifications to the DNA. And it turns out that these modifications can be passed down. I'm not sure whether you can go as far as many hundreds of generations, but certainly up to many tens of generations. And the modifications are passed on from parents to offspring. So you can get modifications. The modifications don't involve primary changes in the genetic material, but they lead to transformations, meaning changes in properties which are passed on. So that's clearly one thing where conventional natural selection won't work. Something else which people are becoming alive to, and this too is now about 40 years old, 35 or 40 years old, is the following. Remember, I told you that in natural selection, the picture we have is of an organism and an environment, and the environment exerts certain pressure on the organism, and the organism responds, but in this roundabout, complicated way, not by directly saying this is how I must respond and doing it, but rather by relying on this series of chance factors, a random mutation leading to a change in the desirable direction and so forth. So this response on the part of the organism is entirely independent of the environmental pressure, right? And the response in the course of time, if it's successful, we say that the organism is adapted to the environment, and we say we chalk it up as a victory for natural selection. But what if the environment is created by the organism itself? Does it make any sense to say that the organism is adapted to it? So look at the weaver bird nests which we see in this country all over the place, or look at the beaver dam which is put up there, right? So these are essential features of the environment of the organism. The weaver bird has to design a nest of a particular kind to remain stable in strong winds, right? To make sure that predators don't get in easily, to make sure that its hatchlings don't drop out, and so on and so on and so forth, right? And its actions are in a sense perfectly adapted to doing so, okay? But the environment didn't come from outside. This wasn't a pressure put on the weaver bird by some external agency. It's something created by the bird itself. Similarly, with a worm which drills a hole in the soil, quite often these are worms which have serrations on their surface, and they, sometimes like a screw, they turn through the soil, and because of the serrations and their turning motion, it makes it very easy for them to bore in and bore out. So would you say that the worm is adapted to this hole? It's made the hole itself. So you see, there are many cases, technically this is called niche construction, many cases of organisms creating their own environment. So obviously here, this demarcation between the environment as something out there and the organism as something here, this demarcation breaks down. So you need to think of evolution of both, because here the environment too evolves in parallel with the organism. The organism has made it. Good. We've talked about these cases of symbiosis and so forth. This is a particularly dramatic example, and this too one sees in many cases. So this is the cleaner bird and the crocodile. Now, if it's the right bird and the crocodile is in the right mood, of course the bird does its cleaning and goes away. Otherwise there's trouble. But the point is that this works. Now clearly this strange behavior on the part of the bird can't be understood without understanding what went on in the crocodile. And similarly this seemingly peaceful coexistence on the part of the crocodile can't be understood without realizing that the bird is doing something to it and the crocodile realizing that this is happening. So here you have a situation in which you have one set of genes in the crocodile, one set of genes in the bird, in the cleaner bird, and these are evolving in parallel. So as far as the crocodile is concerned, the bird is part of its environment. As far as the bird is concerned, the crocodile is part of its environment. And how these patterns of coevolution, you can also call it a symbiotic relationship, how they co-evolved is a matter of some some speculation, some interesting speculation I should say, because you can imagine right at the very beginning, the very first bird which went into the mouth of the very first crocodile may not have had a very good outcome, but this has persisted, this has held on in some way, so we need to understand how that has worked. Right. This is something which botanists discovered long ago and is now coming to be recognized as an important component in animals as well. Remember, I told you earlier that there are genes, that genes specify proteins and proteins specify properties. The environment didn't come into this at all, except as an agency that made it possible for creatures to live. So the environment was taken as an agency that provided oxygen if you needed to breathe oxygen, provided water if you needed to breathe water, so to speak, and so forth, and provided food if you went out and looked for it. So the environment provided what people in biology call a whole lot of permissive inputs, meaning the environment functioned in some rough sense like a railway level crossing, where if the gate was up, the train could pass. But it was not the level crossing gate that made the train pass. Okay. However, there are many situations, and one of them is illustrated here, where the environment in fact exerts a direct input on the shape or form or morphology of the organism. So these are leaf shapes in different kinds of, essentially let's say aqueous environments of the same species, of the same plant, and quite often you can find two different kinds of leaf on literally the same plant, on the same body. And here you see that there is some interesting way in which the environment is playing a direct role on shape and form. So this notion of the environment as being independent of the organism again comes apart here, but in a different way from before. And this kind of thing is called plasticity, because this leaf seems to behave in some sort of a plastic fashion, almost as if it's being molded by the environment. But this molding is of a sort that clearly has evolutionary importance. Well, yet another example of this. Actually, I could have clubbed this with the previous one. This is an organism called Daphnia. And the point about this crustacean Daphnia is that it comes in two forms. One with that big beak-like thing on top, which is sometimes called a sword because it looks like a sword, and the other without, which is the picture on the right hand side. And the interesting thing about this beak-like form is that it develops in this organism when it is under threat of predation. And the beak, as you can see, is essentially functions like a sword to put predators away. So yet again, here you have environment dependent modification, except that this is a living environment, and this modification too turns out can be passed on from parents to offspring, but it's not the modification itself that is passed on, but the capacity to modify that is passed on. As far as our thinking of natural selection goes, the lesson here is that maybe we should think more seriously now of the environment as a player in natural selection itself. Something else, this goes back to what I said earlier about physics and chemistry. You remember I said there is this amoeba, and you have hundreds of thousands of these amoebae coming together and building whole bodies. So this is a time sequence. I think you can see the sequence from the lower right, and the thing you see on the top, which looks like a fungal fruiting body, is the ultimate outcome of this coming together. Now, all of these things that you see here, and in fact it's a great portion of the entire life of this amoeba, all of these things that you see together happen entirely autonomously, right? And they happen as a result of certain physical and chemical forces, chemical signals, responses to those signals, and physical forces when the amoebae come and interact with each other. Which means that there is an entire life cycle, and you can think of the life cycle, if you wish, to a whole play, where the central actors seem to be not genes per se, even though the genes are there of course, but these cells, these amoebae, which are coming together and which are doing this kind of thing. So you have a kind of level of autonomy beyond that of the genes here. The genes in fact here seem to be playing the same kind of permissive role that I said the environment plays in other cases. It allows things to go on, but what actually goes on seems to depend on cellular properties which are a step removed from the genes. And this is something that we are beginning to be aware of now. And for those of you who are interested, especially in the field of cancer biology, this is becoming very at least my colleagues who work in the field tell me that this is becoming a very pertinent and a very relevant topic today, which is the way in which properties of cancer tissues are really cellular properties more than genetic properties directly expressed in these tissues. Right. So, I end by just mentioning this. Evolutionary thinking has now gone beyond biology. And what I mean by that is that people try to come up for explanations in their areas of study which mirror evolutionary explanations. And this has happened in mathematics. In fact, in mathematics, this is a bit amusing because mathematicians, to solve certain problems now, computer scientists especially, use something called genetic algorithms. And these genetic algorithms are a caricature of the sorts of games that DNA sequences play or genes play during reproduction. And these actions of DNA sequences were first put into mathematical form to explain evolution, and now the mathematicians have seized upon it as an interesting tool which is to solve rather difficult problems. And in fact, a couple of problems have been solved rather successfully using them. History, now here I am on very uncertain ground, but again colleagues tell me that people in the field of history have begun to use explanations based on certain historical processes being more likely than other processes, even though they originated in chance events. Certain historical processes are more likely than other processes because they are more successful in some sense. So you see, broadly a selectionist kind of argument. Culture of course is something which evolves, which has evolved, and culture in human beings is a product of evolution. But the question is, how much of it is a product of our biology as well as a product of, let's say, our minds, which is the usual kind of substrate that cultural anthropologists would say is important for culture. Behavior, psychology. So, the list can go on. In all of these areas, evolutionary thinking is permeated. Good. So, theories are usually held to be predictive, or at least that's supposed to be a big strength of a theory. Remember, the big triumph of Newtonian theory was in being able to make precise predictions. Right? So, what does a theory of evolution predict? Now, here, as you can see, both those aspects of evolution that depend on only physics and chemistry and those aspects of evolution that depend only on chance can't make any predictions at all. As I said, they are ahistorical. They simply say, given certain entities with certain properties, certain things will exist. Right? However, natural selection, which lays claim to be a historical theory, should in principle be able to make predictions. So one would think, so one would suppose. In practice, however, the matters are not that easy. And the reason matters are not easy is because the range of possible outcomes open to the simplest sort of genetic system we know today. You might consider the genetic system of a very simple virus as being the most simple around. But if you want to take a more bona fide living organism, maybe some kind of a simple cell, a bacterium or some such thing. So even the simplest genetic system that we have today has at least 1,000 or thereabouts modifiable genes, DNA sequences. And if you assume that each of these DNA sequences can exist in at least 2 different states, one to the other being transited by a random event by a mutation, you see there are 2 raised to the power of 1,000, 2 multiplied by 2 multiplied by 2 1,000 times, 2 raised to the power of 1,000 different states of DNA, if you wish, in this organism, right? Therefore, different possible outcomes as far as the genes of this organism go, and that number is simply astronomical. We can't even begin to think what it is. In fact, if you were to write it conventionally, it would be something like 1 followed by 300 zeros. You just can't make sense of such a big number. And to put it in perspective, physicists estimate that the total number of elementary particles in the universe, in the whole universe, elementary particles, these are electrons, let's say, or protons or neutrons, is of the order of 10 raised to the power 40, 1 followed by 40 zeros. And here we are speaking of 1 followed by 300 zeros. So we just can't make any sense of it at all. Which means to say that the number of possible outcomes in this historical drama, the drama of evolution, the number of possible outcomes is so many that it's pretty much impossible to make any predictions. This is something we have to live with. So if you say, I don't call anything a legitimate scientific theory unless it makes hard and fast predictions, well, too bad. Okay, but it's a perfectly good theory in terms of explaining what you have now. It also indicates likely directions, and there are many cases in which you can make predictions of these likely directions in the short term, and the predictions have been successful. However, there is something which one notices when one looks at the past record of history on Earth, which might enable us to make a prediction and might also give us some pause. This was first pointed out by the paleontologist Lee Van Walen, about 40 years ago. And the past record shows the following. Any lineage of plants or animals that you see on Earth has had a history behind it. And in many cases, this history is recorded in fossils. So Van Walen's paper was written before DNA-based or protein-based evidence came on the scene. So you can build up a history of the fossil record, and you can ask questions like, look, I have this species. So our species, as you know, is called Homo sapiens. I have this species, Homo sapiens. How far back in time does it run? Now, in our case, we have a pretty strong answer. People differ on the details, but perhaps 150,000 years ago. So we are that old. You can ask similar questions about other species as well. Now, when you do this, and when you look at the history of species in the fossil record, you make two discoveries. One discovery is that most of the creatures that ever existed on Earth are in fact not around now. By that I mean most lineages that you see in the fossil record. So you can think of these as lineages not only of species but of larger groupings, things called genera or families. So these are much larger groupings. Turns out that they don't exist anymore. So there are entire families of animals, if you wish, solutions to evolutionary problems which have disappeared. This, of course, is called extinction. So most creatures that have ever existed have gone extinct. And I don't mean the creatures as individuals. All of us will go extinct when we die. But what I mean is their lineage has gone extinct. And Van Walen said, that's interesting. If that is true, is there any way in which I can plot on a graph paper their path to extinction? And he did that, and this is one of a large number of graphs that he assembled. This is for a lineage consisting of animals like sea urchins. These are things called echinoderms, so that kind of grouping. And it turns out that when you plot time on the x-axis, and I hope that's visible there, and number of representatives of this group on the y-axis, what you get, and some of the students here will know what I mean, I'm sure, what you get is what's called a semi-log plot, which looks like a straight line. In other words, this looks very similar to a plot of radioactive decay, if you have learnt of it in school, where the amount of radioactivity in a sample falls exponentially. Therefore, when you plot it on log paper, it seems to go as a straight line. So Van Walen's conclusions were two. One, going by the historical record, most species that have ever existed, or most lineages that have ever existed, have gone extinct. And in fact, he was able to put a number on that, and the number was 99 plus something percent. In fact, there's one place in which he says 99.7%. I don't know what the latest estimate of this is, but clearly well over 99% of lineages that we know of as having existed on Earth have gone extinct. More interestingly, the pattern of their existence has followed, this is purely the mathematics of that pattern, nothing to do with why they went extinct. It has followed this radioactive decay kind of curve, right? Straight line. Now, if you interpret this literally, it simply means that it has followed some kind of a random walk pattern again. Radioactive decay, of course, is a random walk, you know this. Which means, really, that all species, and I've just shown a representative sample here, all species probably are, we don't know for what reason, and I repeat again, by that I mean lineages. All lineages probably are doomed to go extinct in the long run, and to do so in a way which shows that there is no privileged member of this lineage over some other member. You know, I come back to this analogy. Why is the radioactive decay law a straight line, a linear law? Because any atom is as likely as any other atom to decay within the next time period. In fact, that simple assumption that gives you the straight line in the semi-log plot. So these are two conclusions, if extended, really make us sit up, because they say whatever has been going on Earth in the long term doesn't seem to any persistence of any of these organisms, right? So if natural selection is a solution to certain problems from the environment, it's a short-term solution. Secondly, for reasons which aren't clear to us at all, also in the long term, all lineages that appear on Earth seem to decay. So to sum up, the answer to the question what next is, we have a 99.7% chance, if it's valid to extrapolate from this, we have a 99.7% chance of going extinct. So on that not very cheerful note, I end, and I thank you for your patience.
Sure, Dr. Nanjundiah will be happy to answer any questions. Okay.
Professor Nanjundiah, I congratulate you for excellent lecture on evolutionary theory. You mentioned about the role of yellow polyploidy, that it plays an important role in formation and evolution of new species. Whether it follows the pattern of the yellow like sympatric speciation or allopatric speciation. Now, when we talk of the species concept, there are many aspects. If there is a biological species concept or cladistic species concept or evolutionary species concept. So how these concepts and the yellow polyploidy that play a role in the species, and when we can say that this is the species, which concept one should follow keeping in mind the evolutionary concept and evolutionary theories, number one. And number two, the speciation and especially the evolution of species in the islands. When the same species it is growing, and if it migrates to islands, then many of them, they become new species, and many scientists and taxonomists, they report that these are new species on the islands because of the many other factors. So I would like to know about your views about this.
Well, that's a rather technical question. Let me try and address it in brief. So the first part of the question used two words, sympatric and allopatric. So in the context of species, sympatric essentially means that you have a species occupying a certain area. This species evolves into a new species in the same area, within the same area, sympatry. Allopatry refers to the mode of speciation in which you have a species occupying a certain area. Some members of these species are separated from the main body, maybe by a river, maybe by an earthquake which caused a hill to come up or whatever. So there's geographical separation, and then within this newly separated isolate, you have a new species appearing, as you said, on an island. Okay. So both of these are considered by evolutionary biologists, and a model of allopatric speciation is believed to be more plausible in most cases. In other words, for a new species to evolve, it has to get away from its parental species. In the same way as for children to evolve, they have to get away from their parents, if I might say so. Okay. Now, what was the island? No, island I touched on. What was the other one? You said something else.
Species concept.
That's right. Okay. So when you have allopolyploidy, so when you have these two different species getting their genomes coming together and then duplicating, this is rather interesting, because clearly what is happening here requires both of these to be in the same place at the same time. Otherwise, or at least the germ cells to be in the same place at the same time. So this would be a case of sympatry for sure. And then the kind of species that you would have here would clearly be a biological species. Cladistically, again that's a technical term, So cladistics is essentially genealogy in biology. So cladistically, you won't call them parents and offspring in some sense at all. They wouldn't be part of the same lineage, but it would be a biological species.
Say about human evolution. Are human beings evolving? Their brains are still evolving or not?
Yeah, most of the people who are working in this area are convinced that human beings are evolving. In fact, there's a fair amount of evidence now to say that if you look at the great apes, we are members of the great apes. If you look at the great apes, the human lineage has evolved faster than the lineages of the chimpanzee, which is our closest relative, or of the gorilla or the orangutan. Indeed. But the bulk of this evolution has been invisible. So you don't see this obviously in the record of bones and human remains that you find. But this seems to have been largely a change in stature, in skin color, in the ability to digest certain things and not digest other things. A famous example that people work on is the ability to digest milk, what's called lactose tolerance. That's a product of human evolution. So,
there seems to be lots of racial differences in thinking and design of evolution of races. Is there any theory about this?
Quite a bit. In fact, very recently a study has come out trying to suggest that many so-called racial differences actually have a selective basis. Yes.
Sir, what is the effect of the thinkers like Richard Dawkins with the selfish gene or Stephen Gould in the present view of evolutionary theory?
I'm not sure I understand your question. When you say
No,
what is the effect?
Of the thinking of people like Richard Dawkins with this concept of the selfish gene, or the paleontologists like Stephen Gould in the present view of evolutionary theory?
Yeah, I can only give a personal answer. I can't give a general answer because biologists differ strongly in their reactions to Dawkins and Gould. I think Dawkins has been a super popularizer of biology, especially of evolutionary biology, probably peerless. I can't think of anyone who writes as well and as forcefully as him. However, I think he has gone out too far on a limb in developing these interesting metaphors. You mentioned the selfish gene, he has some others as well. Because metaphors sometimes take on a life of their own and then it can get dangerous. So this selfish gene notion has been misused in ways that are unfortunate. That is a bit of a pity. More substantially, I think Dawkins also has not conceded that natural selection is not the sole force or process in evolution. There I think there's something, so he has performed a very useful purpose of trying to come up with selectionist explanations for almost anything. That's useful because that gives you something that you can look at and challenge and refute and so on. But I think he's gone a bit too far in that. Gould, on the other hand, has also been a good popularizer. I don't think he's as good a writer as Dawkins. This is my personal opinion. But Gould's big plus point in my view is that he has been very, very open-minded about the kinds of processes that have been important in evolution. And I think that's been a strong plus in his case. Both of them have done evolutionary biology a huge deal of good.
Just maybe I'm poking my nose, but Darwin was a geologist also. These days, a lot of people, the paleontologists, especially Stephen Gould would be a big name, are talking of punctuated evolution. What is your response to that?
Okay, now again I'll have to give a response of a non-expert. Gould's name came up a while ago. Gould and another paleontologist, Niels Eldredge, who you may know, came up with this supposed observation that if you looked at the evolutionary record, so any one of these lineages that we've been talking about, you found that the forms of animals that you saw remained unchanged for long periods of time and then abruptly changed to something else. Then again remain unchanged for long periods of time, abruptly changed. So in other words, that evolution occurred in jumps which were punctuated, so that's where the word comes from, punctuated by long periods of equilibria, long periods of stasis, as they say. So this was their contention, and it stirred up a huge amount of debate. So at least in one sense, I think the notion of punctuated equilibrium served a very useful purpose, because it made many people go back, look at the data, say, my God, is this true? Because the picture until then had been of evolution as a slow and steady process. I think the upshot has been, after these 40 odd years, upshot has been that it was a mountain out of a molehill. So punctuated equilibrium doesn't seem to be a fact as much as they said. It in fact is gradual. Of course, you can imagine almost any gradual change, if you look at a sufficiently high magnification, will show you bumps. This seems to be the consensus now.
I think before I have one more question there, I would also like to add a comment on your change in the leaf shape you showed under different environmental conditions. In fact, there are many examples of amphibious plants where half the plant is below water, half of them is above water. Not only the leaf shape changes, there is also a change in metabolism as such. There are good examples of C3, C4 change also occurring in. And so I think there's a gross change, not only simple morphology, which is a thing.
That's right. So in fact, it's a change in what you might call the lifestyle, which is what makes it dramatic.
Good.
Yeah. I would like to take your opinion on the issue. Homo sapiens is probably the only species which is trying to change the evolutionary forces on both sides, positive as well as negative. Medical and attempts to conserve the endangered species is one thing where we are trying to revert the evolutionary forces, and plant breeding activities, again, we are trying to accelerate the evolutionary forces. So do you think whatever have been the rules and basic methodologies of evolution to act on this planet will not be holding anymore, because we, being the most dominant species, are totally changing the evolutionary forces?
Well, I would broadly go along with what you're saying. Certainly, there's no doubt at all that as far as human evolution goes, we've been tinkering with it for, I don't know, maybe a couple of thousand years now, in a way that no other animal before us has been able to tinker with its own evolution. This is for sure. Now, as far as the evolution of other species go, it's been a mixed kind of affair. E.O. Wilson estimates that thanks primarily to human intervention, we are losing an average of one species a day. This is his estimate. So clearly we are, in that sense, acting as a huge, what's the right word? Predators on the evolutionary process itself, you might say. But we are also conserving endangered species, so we are trying to, having caused harm, we are trying to see whether we can ameliorate what we have done to some extent.
Against the laws of evolution, against the laws of nature?
Well, it's against nature, that's for sure, yes, yes.
I think there may be many more questions, but we have arranged for some tea and snacks, so you can certainly continue discussion with the speaker there. I think this is time to formally close this session, and I hope you all share my opinion that we have had a wonderful presentation by Dr. Nanjundiah. He took us from Aristotle to Lamarck to Darwinism to Neo-Darwinism, and talking about recent concepts in epigenetics, and also talking about environmental influences. And I think it has been a real treat for all of us to have such a broad knowledge about how evolution has taken place and what is the current status of that. Let's applause once more to Dr. Nanjundiah for the presentation. And with that, we'd like to close, and I invite all of you to join us for a cup of tea in the hall next to this building. Thank you. Please hold on for a minute. There is some formality to be completed. Just now. Yes. Huh?